She was told to play a simple waltz for the Duke of Bramleigh. Then she stunned the entire hall with a masterpiece. The invitation did not come with her name on it. It came with a box of sheet music, a note in pressed handwriting, and the assumption that whoever carried the portfolio into Bramleigh Hall that evening would also set it down quietly and leave before the first candle was lit. Nadia had carried the portfolio. She had been carrying things for other people since she was 11 years old, so she was good at it. She knew how to hold a heavy box without letting her arms show the strain. She knew how to walk through a side entrance without looking like she was aware it was a side entrance. She knew how to be in a room and also not be in it. She was 23. She had her father's hands, broad across the knuckles, slightly too large for her frame, the kind of hands that looked wrong in gloves. The gloves she was wearing that evening did not belong to her. They were a little too long in the fingers. She had borrowed them from the housekeeper, who had borrowed them from someone else, and somewhere in that chain of borrowing the original owner had been forgotten entirely. She thought about that as she walked through the east corridor of the hall. The disappeared woman whose gloves these were, whether she had noticed they were gone, whether she had cared. Bramleigh Hall in winter had the particular smell of a place that had always been warm and had never quite forgiven the cold for existing. Beeswax, coal smoke with a sweet edge to it, old curtains holding on to the memory of tobacco that someone had smoked in a room 40 years ago. It pressed against you when you walked in. Not unpleasant, exactly, just insistent. The event was an engagement announcement. The Duke's daughter, a young woman named Cecilia, who had the quality of someone painted rather than lived, was to be formally announced as engaged to a man from a family in the north. The evening was planned. The flowers were white. The musicians had been hired. The food had been arranged. The guest list had been curated, with the same meticulous attention to order that the Duke applied to everything in his life. The accompanist had fallen ill that afternoon. Not dramatically ill. Just enough. A fever. A note delivered by one of his students. Apologies for the inconvenience. These things happened. The Duke did not accommodate inconvenience gracefully, but he had accommodated it. Someone had looked at Nadia. She had been standing near the archway to the music room, holding the portfolio, not quite blending into the wall because there was a sconce behind her that was angled wrong, and it caught the side of her face and made her visible when she did not want to be. The steward had crossed the room. He had spoken 4 words. "You play, don't you?" It was not a question. She had said yes. She had said yes because the truth was more complicated than the word, and the word was the only one that would land cleanly in that particular corridor, with that particular man looking at her with that particular expression. The truth was, she had been playing since she was 4. The truth was, the sheet music in the portfolio she was carrying was written by her father. The truth was, her father had written it in this very house, at a desk the Duke had provided him, during the 6 months he had spent here as a commissioned composer before he got sick, and after he got sick, and through the last month before he died. The truth was, the Duke had received the work, had received it, and had not paid for it, because her father had died before the final payment was due, and dead men have trouble pressing claims. She had said yes. The steward handed her the sheet music. The engagement waltz, simple in structure, pleasant in arrangement, the kind of piece that existed to fill the air between conversations without demanding to be listened to. He told her she would play at 8:30. She took it. She read it once. She set it on the music stand. She did not open it again. By 8 o'clock the hall had filled in the way that halls like this fill, not with a rush but with a slow, inexorable accumulation of people who all arrived as though they had simply materialized, as though no one had actually driven through the winter dark and handed a coat to a footman and stood for a moment in the cold doorway before stepping into the warmth. They simply appeared. They had always been here. Nadia watched them from the bench. The pianoforte sat at the east end of the room, on a low platform that was not quite a stage, too modest for that, but elevated enough that everyone in the hall could see her hands if they chose to look. Most of them did not choose to look. She was part of the furniture. This was fine. She catalogued the room the way her father had taught her to catalogue rooms, not the people, the acoustics, the ceiling height at the center versus near the windows, the curtains on the north wall, heavy velvet, they would absorb mid-range frequencies. The polished floor in the open center would bounce treble back at an angle. The cluster of guests near the fireplace would dampen bass on that side. She filed each of these things into a part of her mind she kept separate from the rest of herself. The part that was not nervous, never nervous, because it was engaged entirely with the physics of sound. The Duke stood at the far end of the room near a group of men whose collective worth could have rebuilt the East Wing twice over. He had the physical quality of a man who had always been large in rooms and had stopped noticing it. He was not cruel-looking. That was the thing that people who had never met him failed to understand. He looked like what you would want a powerful man to look like: settled, assured, pleasant when he smiled, which he was doing now, slightly, at something one of the men near him had said. Cecilia stood near her mother. She was wearing white, which was expected, and she wore it with the ease of someone who had practiced being decorative since childhood and had gotten very good at it. The fiancé, a man from the north with a pleasant face and unremarkable hands, stood beside her with the look of a person who has won something and is still slightly surprised about it. There were 3 critics in the room. Nadia knew this because the steward had mentioned it to someone else while she was sitting near the archway, and sound traveled in Bramleigh Hall in unpredictable ways. 2 of them were from the capital. One of those 2, a compact man with the bearing of someone who had spent years being right about things and expected to go on being right, had a reputation for describing provincial musical performances with the sort of precision usually reserved for autopsies. She was not thinking about any of them. She was thinking about the sheet music on the stand and what was not in it. Her father had written 3 pieces during his time at Bramleigh. The engagement waltz was the 3rd, but the first piece, the one he had spent 4 months on, the one he had written letters home about in ink that still smelled of the coal smoke in this very building, that piece had never been performed. It had been delivered to the Duke on a Tuesday morning in autumn, 2 weeks before her father's condition made the stairs difficult. The Duke had received it, had thanked him, had indicated payment would follow. Payment had not followed, not because of cruelty, Nadia had decided over the years. Because her father's death had made him inconvenient to remember. The first piece was in the portfolio. She had put it there herself, between the pages of the waltz, because she was 23 and her father had been gone for 8 years and she had been carrying things long enough. The clock at the far end of the hall moved to 8:30. Nadia placed her hands on the keys. She played the opening bars of the waltz. Precisely the waltz. Exactly as written. For 4 bars she was obedient, and invisible, and entirely what the room expected her to be. Then she turned left. Not physically, musically. She took the waltz's key, D major, warm and round, and walked it sideways into the opening of the first movement of her father's real work, the commissioned piece, the one that had never been paid for. The modulation was seamless. Her father had written both pieces in compatible keys, not by accident. He had been meticulous. He had been, before illness made him slow, one of the most technically precise composers anyone in that part of the country had ever heard. Nobody in the room noticed the shift. Nobody was listening yet. The first movement of the piece was called, in her father's handwriting in the margin of the manuscript, simply, Arrival. He had not been a man for elaborate titles. Arrival was what it was. The feeling of entering a room where something important is about to happen and not yet knowing what it is. The music had that quality. It moved like a person moves when they are trying to look at ease and are not quite managing it. Hopeful. A little tense beneath the hope. It was 3 minutes long. By the end of it, 3 things had happened. First, the cluster of guests near the fireplace had gotten quieter. Second, Cecilia had turned her head by about 30 degrees, not toward the room but toward the music, the way you turn toward something without deciding to. Third, one of the capital critics had stopped talking to the man beside him. Nobody had said anything. There was nothing to say. The evening was still proceeding as planned. The music was pleasant. This was all. The second movement was called Waiting. This was the one her father had written during the weeks he could still manage the stairs but chose not to. He had sat in the guest room they gave him, which had a narrow window that looked onto the kitchen garden, and he had written music about patience in a way that only people who are running out of time can write about it. It was not sad music. That was the important thing. It was not the music of grief. It was the music of someone who has decided to pay attention. Nadia had heard it in pieces, fragments he had hummed while he worked, bars he had played for her on the second-hand upright they kept at home, bits of melody she had memorized without trying the way children memorize things they are not aware they are memorizing. She knew it the way she knew her own name, knew it before her hands did, which meant her hands were always a half-breath behind, and she had to trust them to catch up, which they always did because they were her father's hands, and they remembered what they were for. The room had changed. She could feel it without looking up. That particular quality of a space when the people in it have forgotten, collectively, to perform being at a party. The conversations had not stopped, but they had thinned. The way water thins when the temperature drops and it starts to become something else. The man from the north had put his hands behind his back. He was staring at the floor in that way people stare at floors when they are actually listening to something above them. One of the critics, not the compact autopsy review one but the other one, the older woman who wrote for the northern papers and had the manner of someone who had been surprised by music before and had never quite gotten over it, had her hand pressed flat on her thigh. Her fingers were not moving. That was how you knew. The Duke was still talking. He was talking to a baron near the tall windows on the south side of the room, and the sound of his voice carried in that low, certain way that large men's voices carry, the timbre of someone who has never had to raise it to be heard. She played Waiting the way her father had written it. She played the middle section, the one that circled the same 4 notes without resolving them, the one that felt like pacing, like watching a door, and she played it with the particular kind of restraint that is harder than loudness, that costs more, that asks you to give something up rather than add something on. When the second movement ended, there was a gap of 3 beats. In those 3 beats, for the first time since she had sat down, the room was fully silent. Then she moved into the third movement. Her father had not titled the third movement. In the manuscript, the original, in his handwriting, the paper still faintly smelling of the room he had written it in, there was a blank space where the title should be. Below it he had written, in pencil, a note to himself. Here, do not rush this. Make them wait. She had found that note when she was 15. She had read it 40 or 50 times since then. She had thought about it on the train here. She had thought about it in the antechamber while the steward handed her the wrong sheet music. She made them wait. The third movement opened on a single note. High, clear. The kind of note that a room full of people hears differently depending on where they are standing, because a single note in a large space is also every reflection of that note, every angle the sound takes as it moves outward and comes back changed. She held it for 4 full beats. The Duke stopped talking. She did not see it. She did not need to. She felt the quality of the room change the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a settling, like something that has been slightly off balance for a long time finally finding the floor. The third movement was about the thing her father had spent his last year learning, which was that some things cannot be finished, and that this is not the same as failure. It was not music about death. She was clear on this, had been clear on it since she first understood what he had been writing. It was music about incompletion as a natural condition, the way a wave is complete at every point in its movement, not just when it reaches the shore. She played it as if she had written it. Technically, she supposed, under the terms of the Duke's original commission, she had not. The commission had specified that all work produced by her father during his residence at Bramleigh would become property of the estate. This was the clause that had made paying him on delivery rather than on death such a convenient oversight. But her father had written this piece before he came to Bramleigh, had written most of it at their kitchen table, on their second-hand piano in the house they rented on the east side of the town, and had brought it with him because it was not finished yet, and he had hoped the commission's resources would give him the time and quiet to finish it. The Bramleigh commission was the Waltz, and the 2 smaller pieces, not this. He had simply been here when he completed it, which was a different thing entirely. She was not a lawyer. She had never needed to be. But she was her father's daughter, and he had been precise about language, the way only people who know it can be used against them tend to be. She played the passage he had marked. There is a moment in certain pieces of music when the room decides something. You cannot predict it. You cannot engineer it. It is not about the technical skill of the player, or even the quality of the composition. It is about whether the music and the moment happen to be pointed at the same thing at the same time. It is, Nadia had always thought, the reason music exists as a public thing at all, played by people in front of other people rather than simply listened to alone. Because the moment does not happen alone. It requires witnesses. It happened. She felt it pass through the room the way you feel weather change when you are outdoors. Not dramatic, not a thunderclap, just a shift in the quality of the air. The held note she played in bar 43 was not different from the notes around it. But when she lifted her hands off the keys after it, allowing the 2 beats of silence her father had written into the score, the silence was of a completely different kind than the silence that had come before. This was not quiet between conversations. This was a room of people who had forgotten, completely and without meaning to, that there was anything in the world besides the sound that had just stopped. She finished the piece, the 4th movement, her father had called it, in pencil, simply, enough. It took 11 minutes. It was the longest he had written. It revisited themes from the first 3 movements and did with them what time does with things. Softened some, clarified others, made a few of them strange. By the time she played the final chord, her hands were slightly damp. Her back was straight. She had not looked up from the keys in 22 minutes. She lifted her hands. She placed them in her lap. She looked up. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then the woman critic from the northern papers began to clap. It was the particular clapping of someone who is not thinking about whether it is appropriate to clap. Her hands came together and then kept coming together, and she was not looking around to see if others were joining in, which was the thing that made it land the way it did. The absolute lack of social calculation in it. Others joined. Then more. Then the room was applauding in the way that rooms applaud when they are not performing gratitude, but expressing something they have no more precise tool for. Cecilia, standing still near where she had been all evening, had her hand over her mouth. Her father, the Duke, was crossing the room. He walked with the pace of a man who is used to the room rearranging itself for him, and this time the room did rearrange, the guests shifting slightly to create a path without being asked to. He stopped 3 feet from the pianoforte. He was a large man in a room, and the room felt it. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not stand. She did not offer him anything. Not a smile, not a deferential tilt of the head, not the small physical adjustments that mean I know what I am to you, and I am managing your comfort by reflecting it back. She sat on the bench with her father's hands in her lap, and she waited. He said, "That was not the waltz I requested." She said, "No, it wasn't." A pause. The room was still. The applause had died down to something that was almost listening. She said, "It was the piece you commissioned 8 years ago. The one my father completed here. The one you received in October of that year." Something happened to his face. It was not guilt exactly. Guilt implies a full accounting. It was more like the expression of a man encountering a door in a wall he was certain contained no doors. A kind of structural surprise, followed immediately by the instinct to re-examine the architecture. He said, "Your father, Nadia Voss," she said. "You had a room prepared for him, the one overlooking the kitchen garden. He spent 6 months here, a beat. He wrote excellent music," the Duke said. It was, she understood, the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to receive in this room, in front of these people, at this particular moment in the Duke's carefully ordered evening. She nodded. Just once. "He did," she said. The compact critic from the capital found her during the supper hour that followed. He was shorter than she had expected. He had the careful eyes of someone who spent a great deal of time noticing things other people chose not to notice, and he had a glass of wine he was not drinking. "That was your father's work," he said. "Not a question." "Most of it," she said. "Most?" She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated, and she was tired, in the way you get tired after holding yourself very still for a very long time. The fourth movement, she said. He left a sketch. I completed it. She watched the critic do something behind his eyes. When did you complete it? He asked. Gradually, she said, over about 6 years. He was quiet for a moment. Will you perform it again? He asked. She picked up a glass from the tray of a passing server, not because she was thirsty, but because she needed something to do with her father's hands. That, she said, depends on several things. He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood. He had the particular quality of someone who had spent his career translating things that people said around the edges of what they meant, and he had gotten good at it. He nodded. He drank his wine. I'll be attending whatever it is, he said. He said it quietly, like a man confirming an appointment rather than making a declaration, which was how she knew he meant it entirely. He left. She stood with her glass near the edge of the room and watched the evening continue around her. The engagement announcement was made. Cecilia stood beside the man from the north, and the assembled guests raised their glasses, and the appropriate things were said. The flowers looked the same as they had before. The candles had burned down by about an inch. Cecilia looked at her once across the room. It was the look of a person who has been watching someone do something they were told was impossible and is still holding the fact of it, has not yet found a place to put it down. Nadia looked back. Then Cecilia looked away, back to the man beside her, back to the version of the evening that had been prepared for her. Nadia set her glass down on a side table. She walked to the music room, retrieved the portfolio, the original manuscript inside it, her father's handwriting on every page, the title page with his name and the date, and the words Bramleigh Commission, full work in his careful block letters, and she walked back through the east corridor. The borrowed gloves were still on the piano bench. She had left them there intentionally. She did not go back for them. 6 months later, in a concert hall in the capital, not a large hall, not the kind of hall that required a special dress or a borrowed name, Nadia played the complete work, all 4 movements. The title on the program read, Nadia Voss, completed by N. Voss. The compact critic was in the 3rd row. He had brought the woman from the northern papers, who had brought 2 other people Nadia did not recognize. The house was not full. It was not the kind of performance that fills a house before it has been heard. It was the kind that fills houses afterward, in the months when people say, I was there, the first time, before anyone knew. Nadia sat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys and did not look at the audience. She played Arrival. She played Waiting. She played the untitled 3rd movement, the one her father had written in a room overlooking a kitchen garden, in a house that had never quite been his, in the months when the stairs were still manageable and the window light was good. And then she played the 4th, the one she had finished gradually, over 6 years, at the same second-hand upright she had grown up with, in the rented house that was hers now because everyone else who had lived in it was gone. She had not written it to complete what he started. She had written it because the piece had an ending that she could hear, faintly, the way you can sometimes hear a word before you think of it, and eventually she had sat down and let her hands find it. The ending was not what she had expected when she was young. It was quieter. It resolved, but not the way resolutions in music usually resolve. Not with a landing, not with a final assertion of the home key. It ended mid-breath. It ended on a note that was technically stable but that carried, because of everything that had come before it, the feeling of something that is finished without being closed. Her father would have approved. She thought he would have approved. When the last note faded out, not cut off, not rounded, just let go, released the way you release a breath you did not know you had been holding, the hall was quiet, in the way that only certain things make it quiet. She lifted her hands. She placed them in her lap. Outside it was raining. She could hear it against the high windows of the hall, a sound that had nothing to do with anything, just water arriving the way water arrives, without drama, without knowing what it interrupts. She sat very still. She waited for whatever came next,